So let me get situated while we're the green button, right? Good, thanks. So thanks. I thought I'd start off with a little bit of an exercise here and ask you all what's wrong with this picture. I understand it's hard to participate when you're covered. So let me offer a few suggestions to help move it along. One is that it's a mess. That's pretty obvious. The activity that's taking place here is described in a variety of different ways. One of those is peat mining. The other is peat harvesting. And part of what's interesting here is that the terminology that we use says a lot about the orientation of people to the activities that are taking place. So there's a bit of a struggle with the industry that does this work over what kind of terms we use. But there are some invisible or relatively invisible problems with this picture as well. One of those is the ecosystem disturbances that are taking place. We don't see directly the impacts on biodiversity, on the local ecosystem. And what we absolutely don't see is the carbon leakage that takes place from these kinds of areas that have been disturbed. My training is as a social scientist. I'm not a soil scientist. And it was shocking for me to learn how much carbon leakage comes from these degraded wetland areas. Half of Iceland's emissions come from carbon, of course they come from carbon, but they come from degraded wetlands, something in the neighborhood of 20% of Sweden's, just as examples. So let me move on to following up on Gustav's very nice presentation, and thanks for providing the background on that as well. I think what we want to focus on is a broader question of what is the social response to the ecosystem changes that human activities have generated. And that turns out to be a fairly complex question because it requires us to think iteratively, not just in the one step kind of what do I get for these actions that we often engage with. And that's part of the complexity of the kind of analysis that this project has tackled. So what I will do here is focus on some of the main findings of the second phase report with that broader question in mind. Next slide, please. That's me, right? Thanks. So the conceptual, I'm going to, if it's not already clear, I'm going to have a hard time coordinating the finger punch and the button here at the same time. So bear with me. We're using a model described as social ecological systems model. And to my friends among the permanent participants, indigenous communities, who've reminded us, well, this is how we have always thought about our environment, about ecosystems. But I'm afraid that science in the Western form has often not thought about it in terms of this holistic picture. We often carve things up into the social component and the ecosystem component. And what I would say now is that this right-hand side here, segment, we actually know a huge amount about human impacts on wetland ecosystems, what kinds of activities are impacting them, and what the outcomes, what the consequences are that come around in terms of ecosystem services. What we've paid a lot less attention to over the decades is what is the social response to the changes that we're bringing about in terms of wetland degradation, in terms of loss of these ecosystems. And some of those responses have been driven by, for example, problems with migratory bird species who lose habitat. But we not only need to think about this entire cycle systematically, but we need to think about this cycle as repeating itself so that we're not only responding to the first order changes that we bring on, but we're responding to forks in the road, you could say, that occur when those changes are reinforced and strengthened. And what we often find is that some groups in society find those changes to be opportunities, while other groups in society read those changes as real warning signals that we need to respond to and back off. And that's where a lot of the social struggle takes place. I'm going to get this before I'm finished here. So one of the studies that we reviewed looked at the different kinds of human activities that impact wetland ecosystems. And it seems pretty rudimentary looking down this list. You would think, okay, well, I understand all of these things: filling, draining, excavating, grazing, changing nutrient levels, climate change. And what I've added on here is cognitive, because that has an impact as well. What's important about creating these categories is understanding the temporal and spatial distance between the activity and the consequences that take place, and the differences between the organized groups in society that benefit from these activities and the ones who either may be observers who aren't especially aware, or who may find themselves suffering from the side effects of these things. The further away we get from direct consequences, the harder it is to attribute activities as causes and to misexplain them as being something else. This is one of the challenges that we've wrestled with climate change over the last multiple decades, that it's distant, it's complex, it has many causes, and it's quite similar with degradation of wetland ecosystems. These different kinds of human activities require different sorts of policy interventions to steer them. And it's obvious here that when we're talking about climate change, those interventions look very different in drawing down carbon emissions than the direct mining of peat or other kinds of disturbances that take place during oil and gas exploration, for example. And I would argue that the cognitive differences are important as well. I came into this thinking, y'all have heard the phrase, don't drain the swamp. It's been around for 100 years, most recently used by a president recently pushed out of office. But it's an old phrase that's been used in the British Isles, used in the US, not only by Donald Trump, but also Nancy Pelosi. And the idea still holds in a lot of people's imagination that swamps, wetlands are something to be drained, that they're not useful or important in some way. And part of the challenge that we face is helping people to understand the connections that Gustav pointed to, that it's climate regulation, it's food security, it's ecosystem services of a whole variety, it's buffering against flooding, providing water sources, filtering, this whole range of services. But for most of us, it's like understanding the source of electricity comes out of the wall, and that's as far as we get, following it upstream. So we need to think also about how people conceive of the issue. One of the things we did for the phase 2 study was collect case examples from the participating countries of activities to do restoration of wetland areas that have been degraded. And the variation was much too large to make any clear generalizations, apart from saying just a few things. One, from all of these countries, they range from very small scale restoration efforts, finding a small spring that was blocked and trying to restore that in the context of commercial activity nearby, to restoring sort of quite wide areas that have been disturbed by oil and gas exploration and just left a mess afterwards. The complexity is different, but what we can also say is there are two major categories of restoration with different kinds of techniques that are necessary. In the Scandinavian countries and in parts of Canada, the main damage has been done by ditching and draining, trying to make the land useful for other activities. In Alaska, parts of Canada, and Russia, a lot of the damage is done by oil and gas exploration and heavy equipment that's damaged tundra, and the plant life complexity there requires different sorts of measures. It's also much trickier to do the restoration. Scandinavia, it's a lot of backfilling ditches and making sure your equipment doesn't sink into the space that you're restoring. But lots of insights, and it also is a reminder that we know more than enough to take action and to ramp up those activities. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly, but part of what we saw is a lot of complexity in the policy structure and implementation across the Arctic countries. And I think we often overlook it. We talk about policy as the solution to the social issues or environmental issues that we face. And I spent a lot of years doing legislative work thinking that if we managed to pass a new law or new regulations that we had succeeded, and discovering afterwards that that wasn't nearly enough. So we need to think of this as a chain of actions, from recognizing and defining a problem to determining the shape of that problem, developing measures to correct it, and implementing those measures. So all the way from knowledge to action. Part of what we find here is that that process goes on across different scales. So from local to regional to national to international. And because it's going on at different scales, it doesn't always synchronize very well. So what you get very often in this nested system are regulations at the national level that mesh pretty badly or dysfunctionally with what's being done at a local level. And one of the areas of streamlining that we referred to in the report is making sure that we actually look at how these policies hang together and take steps to align them so that they're much more effective in this space. So it's not that a lot of work has not been done, but there's a lot of alignment that needs to take place. One of the other elements of this policy structure is that when authority is granted to government agencies or by government agencies or to civil society organizations, it's often very mixed. It's sort of distributed in according to different logics. And one of the problems with that is that you also get conflicts over the authority. So an easy example is in the United States, the authority for wetland protection falls under both the Environmental Protection Agency and under the Army Corps of Engineers. And I don't have to tell you that the missions of those two organizations are a little bit different. So they sometimes collaborate quite well, but they don't always play well together. And this is another one of these areas where streamlining or deciding who's in charge ultimately has to take place and hasn't taken place yet. This is just a listing. We have similar issues. This is a model of Norway's process of integrating the Water Framework Directive at the European Union level down to the national level, down to local level activities. So this also speaks to Victoria's work on Indigenous engagement with wetlands areas in the report that she authored. This was a piece that for us is really important in thinking about how authority and power are distributed in this process of management of these areas. And the nice thing in this continuum, and you'll all be familiar with this, that the labels that are used aren't always exact descriptions of the activity that's taking place. So sometimes what's described as cooperation or co-production is really just informing a local community that something's going to happen. So prepare for it. That would be on the left-hand side. It's even, I think, generously labeled consultation. On the other side is a process where the engagement starts early. A problem is identified collaboratively, and plans for how to engage with that problem in a way that don't create sort of new problems on the way are worked out. And it's actually pretty hard to create new policy and new interventions that don't have some unwanted side effects, but you're much more likely to avoid those when these kinds of things are designed with a mix of scientific knowledge, experiential knowledge, indigenous knowledge that's developed over centuries or more, and put together in a context where we we draw on these different kinds of expertise, but different areas of use. So this is the other analogy in this kind of a process is often people talk about the tip of the iceberg. But this is an area where we found things virtually absent. Public perceptions of wetlands, very, very little research done on this. A handful of studies. What we mostly know are the political slogans, don't drain the swamp. Organized interests. Also very little research on the policy networks or organizational coalitions that pursue various interests, and even where policies are being pursued can be blocked or slowed down by particular kinds of organized interest. And connected to that public policy, which in order to, at least in my experience of public policy work, it's necessary to build a coalition of organized interests that may come to the group for somewhat different reasons, but share a common set of outcomes that they'd like to see. And all of that is the part of the whale that's below the surface. We know there's a lot there, and we know that it has a huge influence on our pathway forward and how fast we can cover that pathway. But there's a lot of work to be done to tease that out. So that's also Greenland. So thank you, and be happy when we come to the discussion section to take up points. Thanks a lot.